Well, good morning. It's my pleasure to introduce our Convocation speaker. Michael J. Gerson is a nationally syndicated columnist whose column appears twice weekly in the Washington Post. He's also the author of Heroic Conservatism and co-author of City of Man, Religion and Politics in a New Era. Gerson is a senior advisor at ONE, which is a bipartisan organization dedicated to the fight against extreme poverty and preventable diseases. He also serves on the United States Holocaust Memorial Council, the Holocaust Memorial Museum's Committee on Conscience. He's on the board of directors of Bread for the World and the Initiative for Global Development Leadership Council, and on the board of the Center for U.S. Global Leadership. From 2006 to 2009, Mr. Gerson was the Roger Hertog Senior Fellow at the Council of Foreign Relations. Before that, he was a top aide to President George W. Bush as assistant to the President for Policy and Strategic Planning. While there, he played a significant role in advocating for the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, PEPFAR, the President's Malaria Initiative, the fight against global sex trafficking, and advocating for funding for women's justice and empowerment issues. Prior to that appointment, he served in the White House as Deputy Assistant to the President and Director of Presidential Speechwriting. Mr. Gerson joined George Bush's presidential campaign in early 1999 as Chief Speechwriter and a Senior Policy Advisor. Since 2010, he's contributed regularly to Capital Commentary, the journal of the Center for Public Justice. In the same year, he also delivered the Center's annual Kuiper Lecture on Capitol Hill, titled City of Man. This is also the title of his most recent book. Mr. Gerson is a graduate of Wheaton College, and he and his family live in Northern Virginia. And this morning, he'll speak to us on the topic, 3 Responses to Suffering. Please join me in welcoming Michael Gerson to Gordon College.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. It's really an honor for me to be with you and to be here at Gordon College, the Center of Evangelical Education, here at the Center of American Higher Education. I'm told this chapel is the largest regular meeting of evangelicals in all of New England, which is a little like being the largest wine appreciation club in all of Salt Lake City. I actually visited Gordon many years ago when I was looking for colleges to attend. Ended up going to Wheaton. But I know what it's like to attend a religiously conservative school. When I went to Wheaton, the joke on campus was that the administration had banned premarital sex because it might lead to dancing. That code of conduct, it turns out, is now sweeping the country. We may soon have a president, Mitt Romney, who is opposed to the use of all tobacco, caffeine, and alcohol. When Romney's wife, Ann, was asked to dish some dirt on her husband, she admitted that Mitt likes to drink caffeine-free Diet Coke, or, as it is known in the Mormon community, a dangerous gateway drug. Since college, I've had a lot of jobs in my life, in the media, working on Capitol Hill, working in the White House. I've even been on The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, which is the only thing I've ever done that impressed my children. But my college years at Wheaton remain some of the most vivid of my life. And when I think of college, I think of my roommates. I talked to one of them, Scott, this morning. And then there was Jordan, the king of campus. He was class president. He wore blue and orange to every home game. He knew the name of everyone on campus. I knew the name of just about no one on campus, but Jordan and I got along, talking politics, making macaroni and cheese almost every night, ditching study to go out for fried food. After we graduated in 1986, Jordan stayed in Chicago, and I went to Washington, D.C. We talked by phone once or twice a week. He started law school in Tennessee. We talked less and less until my calls went unreturned. I thought he was busy, had a new life and new friends. Years went by, and then I learned from Scott that Jordan had AIDS. We went to see him in the hospital in Florida, shockingly thin, beset by infections. His life seemed as fragile and temporary as snow in a warm hand. It was only a few years before the development of miracle drugs that could have saved his life. But he died in 1994 at the age of 30. America at that time was in the midst of a national debate. A leading Christian pastor said this: AIDS is God's judgment on a society that does not live by his rules. A majority of evangelicals shared that belief. People with AIDS often died exposed, blamed, and stigmatized. I remember thinking at the time, why God's judgment for this, and not for pride or spiritual arrogance or cruelty? Why should some human failures gain a special category of shame, while others are conveniently minimized? And a principle first became clear to me. There is nothing that more vividly and directly reveals our image of God, our conception of God, than our reaction to suffering. So today I want to outline 3 Christian responses to suffering. There actually might be 4 before I'm done. And these, I think, determine in many ways our witness to the world. The first reaction is judgment. Following the attacks of September 11th, 2001, which took place while I was in the White House, the immediate response of some Christian pastors was remarkable. 2 prominent leaders blamed abortionists, feminists, gays and lesbians, and the ACLU for America's deserved punishment on 9/11. Following the Haitian earthquake, one leader blamed some historical Haitian pact with the devil for the deaths of 200,000 men, women, and children. These examples may sound absurd, but this general attitude is more common among evangelicals than we imagine or admit. Without denying that God is ultimately in charge of history, it is necessary to assert that such interpretations of tragic events are offensive and theologically unsound. It is not immediately evident why religious leaders should have special prophetic insight into God's purposes in history, or why the failures that especially offend them should count more than other sins such as pride, social injustice, and indifference to the poor, or why the family of a 9/11 victim should blame the ACLU rather than Al-Qaeda. A simplistic conception of divine providence, the punishment of individuals for the sake of corporate offenses, makes a mockery of individual moral agency and opens Christian leaders to charges of monstrous indifference to tragedy. As is sometimes the case, Christian leaders were making an argument directly rejected by Christ himself. Or those 18 who died when the tower in Siloam fell on them, he said, do you think they were more guilty than all the others living in Jerusalem? I tell you no. And again, as Jesus walked along, he saw a man who had been blind from birth. His disciples asked him, Rabbi, was it his sin or that of his parents that caused him to be blind? Neither, answered Jesus. It was no sin, either of this man or of his parents. Rather, it was to let God's work show forth in him. Every nation, like every life, is a mixture of ruin and nobility. The theologian Richard Mouw puts it this way: the antithesis between godliness and ungodliness is very real, but it is discernible not only in the larger patterns of culture, but also in the inner battlegrounds of our own souls. In Christian belief, God's ultimate goal is to bring men and women into communion with himself. His dealings with the world serve that purpose, and God's purpose can be advanced through redemptive suffering, which is not a punishment, but a mystery and a method of grace. The workings of God in the midst of tragedy cannot be reduced to a simplistic moral mathematics in which sin yields disaster. Believers share the blessings and tragedies and diseases of their neighbors and should work and pray for the good of others, not declare the suffering of their neighbors to be something deserved. A second, more hopeful response to suffering is compassion. While a few blamed Haiti for their own earthquake, many more rushed to help the victims. This represents not only a different view of those who suffer, but a different view of God, the image that we see in Jesus. The relief of suffering was essentially related to the announcement of his kingdom, and the healing of disease played an important symbolic role. It previewed the greater healing of all creation, the end of blindness, the end of mental anguish, the end of afflictions such as leprosy that marked men and women as outcasts. Christ's healing ministry was a protest against the random cruelties of this world and the promise of a better world to come. Some historians credit, in part, the rapid expansion of Christianity in the Roman Empire to the willingness of Christians to serve their neighbors in times of plague, to enter the houses of the sick when no one else would. It is the proper way to serve a God of mercy and to make him known to others. And I've seen this kind of witness in many places, from inner cities to the developing world, particularly in the response to HIV/AIDS. I've met nuns in Ethiopia who care for HIV-positive orphans, and a pastor in South Africa who promotes AIDS prevention among sex workers, and a pastor's wife in Zambia who delivers patients to the hospital by bicycle, and a nurse in Uganda who began paying for the AIDS drugs of patients with their own money. By worldly standards, these are buried lives in remote places. They are actually some of the most powerful representatives of God on earth. In these places, the kingdom of God is arriving day by day. The third Christian response to suffering is justice, which is the responsibility of a community, the work of citizens, not just individuals. And here I'll spend a little more time because it's an area where I've spent some time. Over the last few decades, Christian involvement in politics has gotten a bad name, some of it deserved. The religious right led Christians back into the public square after a long absence, but it left the public square littered with anger and rhetorical excess. The movement began as a reaction against the aggressions of the modern world. It ended by squandering much of its promise because it was too reactive. Often it reacted to anger with anger. It reacted against the liberal social gospel by downplaying the very idea of social justice, thus narrowing the range of evangelical social concern. The result was often a partisan agenda, and a partial one. The wrong kind of politics can not only compromise an individual believer, but undermine the message of the church itself. Any political movement, particularly a virtuous political movement, can become a consuming substitute for faith. And the line is fine between zeal and anger. In the epilogue to A Severe Mercy, Sheldon Vanniken writes, "I was one of those caught up in the mood and action of the 1960s. Christ, I thought, would surely have me oppose what appeared an unjust war. But the movement, whatever its ideals, did a good deal of hating. And Christ gradually was pushed to the rear. Movement goals," he continues, "not God, became first. I now think that making God secondary, which in the end is to make him nothing, is quite simply the mortal danger in social action. Some may avoid this danger, perhaps, but I was not obeying the first and greatest commandment, to love God first, nor is it clear that I was obeying the second, to love my neighbor. Hating the oppressors of my neighbor isn't perhaps quite what Christ had in mind." Same story has been told again and again on left and right. Instead of providing an independent voice, instead of being the steadfast representatives of another kingdom, Christians merely baptize someone else's ideological agenda. They are reduced to a tool in the power game of others. And as Father Richard Newhouse once bluntly put it, the church as a tool is a church of fools. In every generation, some believers conclude that political engagement is not worth the risk and inevitable cost. We hear those voices again. It is increasingly argued in Christian circles that culture is upstream from politics, that songs and scholarship, movies and technological innovation, novels and newspapers ultimately determine a nation's shape, not primarily its laws. And there is truth in this point. Politics usually involves one form of power, coercion, either through the demands of law or the demands of taxation. But there are other forms of power in a society: the power of beauty and myth, the power of ideas and academic excellence, the power of example and integrity. So perhaps Christians should focus more on cultural formation than political activism. Perhaps they should be content with demonstrating the values of the city of God instead of writing statutes for the city of man. The problem is this: culture is upstream from politics, except in those important cases where politics is upstream from culture. In April of 1963, a group of 8 Birmingham clergy members made a famous argument about the limits and dangers of political activism. Writing in the Birmingham News, they criticized civil rights demands as, quote, unwise and untimely, and urged believers to show patience. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., then in the Birmingham City Jail, began writing a response on the margins of a newspaper. King's argument was simple and damning. Patience for political injustice comes easier for those who are not currently experiencing injustice. Perhaps it is easy, he said, for those who have never felt the stinging darts of segregation to say, wait. But when you have seen the vicious mobs lynch your mothers and fathers at will and drown your sisters and brothers at whim, when you have seen hate-filled policemen curse, kick, and even kill your black brothers and sisters, when you are harried by day and haunted by night by the fact that you are a Negro, living constantly at tiptoe stance, never quite knowing what to expect next, and are plagued with inner fears and outer resentments, then you will understand why we find it difficult to wait. All of the cautions about a politicized faith are true. Thinkers such as Reinhold Niebuhr are correct to urge realism about the world, humility in making grand moral claims, and suspicions about our own political motives. But Christians, particularly younger Christians, should internalize King's prison letter before accepting Niebuhr's corrective. A distrust of political action, a preference for gradual cultural change, would have left legal segregation in place. Changing a culture of bigotry required both the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, coercive measures that created a social expectation of equal treatment and shifted the political balance of power in America. And none of this would have happened without idealism, impatience, and the single-minded pursuit of justice. At any given moment in a democracy, great issues of justice and morality are at stake. The idea that people of faith can take a sabbatical from politics to collect their thoughts and lick their wounds is a form of irresponsibility. It is, in fact, an argument that could only be made by comfortable Christians. If one lived in a neighborhood plagued by poverty, dominated by gangs, and served by failing schools, there is no sabbatical from the failures of politics. Getting drug dealers off the corner and teaching children the basics of reading and math are at least as important as long-term cultural change, and certainly more urgent in those neighborhoods. If one lived in a foreign country without medicines for AIDS, malaria, or tuberculosis, or dominated by a cruel dictator, the current policy priorities of the American people and its government would matter greatly to you. Retreating from the cause of justice, even temporarily, is only conceivable for those who have few needs for justice themselves. The alternative to doing politics badly is doing politics better, not turning against the political process itself. The focus of our political engagement will naturally vary by interest and background, but the primary shared Christian political commitment, the value and dignity of every human life, is challenged at home and across the world by poverty and family breakdown and racism and corruption and abortion on demand and slavery and preventable disease and wasteful conflict. We cannot praise the examples of Wilberforce and Bonhoeffer and remain blind to the challenges of our time. The world does not lack for great causes. It only lacks for people who will make those causes their own. In a very limited way, I've seen what politics can accomplish. My best experience in government was this. I sat in the Oval Office and watched President George W. Bush make the decision to approve the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, PEPFAR, the largest initiative to fight a single disease in human history. And I've seen the results. Until 6 or 7 years ago, in that orphanage in Ethiopia I mentioned earlier, the sisters could only hold the hands of children as they died. Not a single one survived. Some of the infants were blinded by infections. Some of these children near death asked the sisters, "Why can't you come with me where I'm going? Why do I have to go alone?" But then the AIDS drugs started arriving. Now almost no children are dying at that orphanage. I saw infants who had their sight restored. I met children who had come back from the brink of death like Lazarus. It is the closest I have ever come to seeing the wonders of the New Testament. More than 5 million Africans are now on AIDS treatment that came too late for my friend. Americans should know about this achievement and be proud of it, and Christians should be the strongest base of support for such works of healing and mercy. This is the type of cause, the cause of healing and hope and human dignity, for which Christians should be known. I'd like to conclude here on a high note, but I can't. There is a fourth and final response to Christian response to suffering, the response we make to suffering of our own. Here I'm neither an expert nor a model, but I've seen enough to know that while suffering is not a punishment, it is also not a picnic. What I saw at the bedside of my friend in Florida was ugly and unnatural. The Apostle Paul talked about welcoming affliction, something I have never managed to do. Suffering teaches some of the hardest lessons. It often demands the surrender of independence, the end of pretense, the acceptance of squalid truths about ourselves. It may involve being exposed and stigmatized, shamed and blamed, despised and rejected of men. In the worst suffering, we do not have an explanation, but we do have an example. The broken God, the suffering God, his life as fragile as snow in a warm hand. The poet Jane Kenyon wrote, "The God of curved space, the dry God, is not going to help us, but the son whose blood splattered the hem of his mother's robe." And that was the greatest response to suffering, to embrace it for the sake of the whole world. At some point in this life or in the transition to the next, we will be the ones who suffer. We will stand with empty hands, objects of the compassion of others. The protections of pride and affluence will vanish. The distinctions of distance and culture will collapse. We will find ourselves just as enslaved, just as diseased, and just as loved by God as those we once stooped to pity. And then, God willing, we will find that the cup of suffering is somehow miraculously also the cup of joy, and we will not let it pass from us. For God sent not his Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved. Even me, even you, even everyone. Thank you very much.